Oh, excellent. So, welcome everyone to the second part of our talk with Michael J. Bowen, the film historian, researcher, and biographer of Doris Wishman and Joe Sarno, among others, because I know that you're working on the biography of Gigi Allen as well, as we
G.G.
mentioned.
Allen,
Yeah.
yes, a change in a change in some ways, not in others, maybe.
Yes, yes. So, uh, if you remember, we ended up basically mentioning the name of the I would I would say one of the most important, if not the most important persons in the exploitation genre, which is Joe Sarno, and who was one of the pioneers in the genre. And let's first, I would like to know how and when did you meet Joe Sarno?
Sure, I met Joe Sarno the day before September 11th, when the World Trade Centers came down.
Really?
Yes, and I was not living in New York at that time. I was living actually in Europe. I was living in Paris, but I was back in the States to do a few things. And while I was here, I made a point of coming to meet Joe, largely because he had worked with so many actors and actresses in New York sexploitation in the 60s that I was hoping he could help me learn something about people who had worked with Doris Wishman. Yeah,
Mhm. So
about who.
that was the bridge, yeah, going from Doris Wishman to Joe Sarno.
Correct. I mean, I was well aware of Joe's films, but I was working on researching Doris's career, and I figured Joe could help me. And his name was right in the New York phone book back in the days when you had those great big fat phone
Yes.
books mailed to you. So he was willing to meet with me in person at his apartment, and he was a lovely guy, very helpful, and I just felt an immediate kinship for him, real friendship, and also his wife Peggy. They were
Hmm.
both delightful people, and so when I came back to the States, not too long after that, at the end of that year, I moved to New York, and at that point, I began to have a regular friendship with them, and because I had been doing so much interviewing and so much research relative to Doris Wishman's career. And since Joe was still with us and had a good memory and was
Hmm.
very friendly, I began recording interviews with him and then reaching out to people who had worked with him, etc. So I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I've interviewed dozens of people who worked with him over the years.
Yeah.
He had a very long and prolific career. And while the book is still in what I will call its larval form at this point, it's much more of a caterpillar than a butterfly.
Hmm. Yeah.
It pretty much amounts to mountains of research and no book. We'll get it done in the next few years and get it out there. And in the meantime, I believe that somebody else is working on a book about Joe's cinema, which may not have as much detail relative to his
Yes.
biography because I don't think they did the same type of research I've been doing, but I'm sure that it will be a very interesting book analyzing his films, etc. So I don't know when that will be out. It might be out before mine, it might not be, but there, hopefully in the next few years will be a couple of worthy books about Joe's career, and he certainly deserves to be better known and to have his career be better documented.
Well, I have to say for myself that I came to know, the some legendary names in the exploitation cinematography, being sexploitation or other kind of exploitation quite recently, I think about 2014. And obviously, Joe Sarno never come to my radar. I started with basically with Jesus Franco, just Franco, which for me was a real eye opener because like you never knew about the guy like in the mainstream because even better than me, not much Franco, for example, in the mainstream. So obviously, I'm not surprised that Joe Sarno to a normal, like a regular normie, if we can use this term, very loosely, will say nothing. So I guess yeah, that's right. That it's long overdue to basically to pay a tribute to the one of the father of exploitation movies. And I have to
Yeah,
say, I did a little bit of research, basically just to appease my curiosity, and I saw some scenes of his movies, and I have to say that now I understand why those films are important. They are not important for the sex scenes themselves. Maybe 30 years ago, I would watch them just for them. Yeah, I would be young.
or more like 60 years ago now.
Well, 60. Yeah, I'm not
Yeah,
60 years old. No, but yeah, but you
right.
know what I mean. When I was like
Yes,
in
personally. Yeah.
yeah, in teenage years, like 18, 19, 20, you watch the kind of movies for the tits and ass. But yeah, I can see, and especially in his work, why it's important, because obviously he was not like just the regular run-of-the-mill cinematographer, as we can say. So, talking about him, what was the obviously the point was with Doris Wishman was the point of contact, but as you delve into his work, what struck you as the most important aspect of his work?
Yeah, just like with Doris, my main interest had to do with the way Joe makes movies. In other words, the formal qualities of his filmmaking as opposed
Hmm.
to the subject matter, right?
Yeah.
So, to think about this with respect to painting, there are some people who like paintings of horses
Yep.
and they don't think about how the horses are painted. And then there are some people who like painting and they think about how any subject can be painted, right?
Yes.
There are
Technique
different
and all the stuff. Yeah.
technique, exactly. So Joe struck me right off the bat as a completely original filmmaker who, like Doris, was basically self taught. It wasn't impossible to get formal training in filmmaking at that time in the early 60s. It was possible. But most of the people who were working in low budget filmmaking didn't go to film school and they basically had to learn how to make a movie on their own.
Hmm.
So, the easiest thing they could have done was to simply copy the way other people make movies, although that isn't always possible from a financial point of view because movies are very expensive and low budget movies don't have enough money to do certain things.
Yeah.
Um, but what Joe and Doris seem to have done is to have contrived a cinema that um, that embodied fairly unique formal principles, which they contrived on their own. And that's the reason why I think they're great filmmakers. So as you said before, there were reasons to be interested in the subject matter of Joe's films in the 60s because the sexual content or the nudity or whatever, certainly went beyond what you would find in any conventional film of the time. So if that's what you were interested in, yes, Joe was a pioneer in terms of that type of subject matter. But he
Yes.
was also a very original filmmaker whose work, if you ask me, is so unique that it probably can't even be imitated by somebody without other people saying, "Oh, you're trying to make a movie that looks like a Joe Sarno movie." It's a very distinctive style, but also a very personal style. Just like with Doris, if anybody tried to copy Doris's technique literally, everybody who knew cinema would say, "Oh, you're trying to make a Doris Wishman movie," right? So the techniques are not
Yeah.
entirely they're not entirely robust in the sense that they can't be adopted by a lot of other filmmakers and become part of a general approach to filmmaking. They're very, very personal. But I like that about art making, not just cinema, the same with painting, the same with music. Something that sounds or looks or feels so unique that it's very hard for you to miss the fact that this person made it. And Joe definitely qualifies as that kind of an art maker for sure.
Well, I read a quote. I don't know who said that, but the quote was basically, or the statement was like that they called Joe Sarno an American Ingmar Bergman.
Bergman, right?
Yeah, which I can see now. Although I have to say I didn't see or haven't seen a lot of Bergman films because to be honest, I'm more like a trash movie enthusiast. I'm not into
Sure.
like art house and stuff like that because to be honest, I'm not on the level to appreciate that. I will say that's frankly like that because it is. Not many people can appreciate it. That's probably what separates the the experts, or the cinema fields, as they call them, from our casual viewers. But yeah, I can say, because the last time, not recently, I just watched The Virgin Spring from Bergman, and just from watching this movie and watching a couple of scenes from Joe Sarno's movie, I can see where the comparison, or that attribution to be American Bergman, came from. Because yeah, that's style, this especially black and white, because black and white can be so subtle in color. It's not just the black and white, because they are 256 shades of gray, as they say. So obviously that might be a lot of nuances. We just it's up to the watcher of the movie to catch, I would say.
Yeah, Joe's work has been compared to Bergman's work, and there are reasons why that's valid. And Joe very much respected Bergman, and he was actually what we call a film buff,
Yeah.
who used to go to what we call the art cinemas that showed the imported foreign films. And those are the kind of places where you'd see work by Bergman and Fellini and the French New Wave and Kurosawa and these well-known international filmmakers who were working outside of the Hollywood system. And they were all great filmmakers. And I don't think that it what they did is that inaccessible. There are aspects of Bergman's work that are intellectually complicated because of the type of scripts he decides to employ and the themes that he claims he wants to deal with. But when you're just thinking about the image and the sound and
Yeah.
how the image is produced, how the camera is used, how editing is used, how sound is used, then I don't think that they're inaccessible at all. And
What I
don't particularly argue that I don't particularly believe that a movie has to be, quote, intellectual to be good cinema. That's why there are some great films in and amongst so-called genre films or trash films, as you said before,
Yeah.
because as films, from a technical, formal point of view, they're very unique. Now, whether they're talking about, Nietzschean philosophy or religious angst or something
Yeah.
like that, that's a separate issue from me. In fact, I'm not so certain that the cinema is a very good philosopher, even when people try to do philosophy in the cinema. It's a audiovisual art form. It strikes you on a very visceral level. It strikes the eye, it strikes the ear. There's only so much to think about.
Yeah.
And you can have a bunch of intellectual sounding dialogue, but it's probably better to read that kind of stuff in
Yes.
books that deal with it in more detail. So Sarno may have used a couple techniques that are similar to techniques seen in a limited number, I would say, of Bergman's films. Because don't forget, Bergman was a real experimentalist. His so-called style changed over time. Ironically, Bergman's obsessions with respect to subject matter stayed pretty similar. He
Hmm.
sort of kept making films about the same issues, but he would experiment with style.
Yes.
So there's a period, in the by the mid '60s, he's doing some far out stuff with films like Persona, and I'm more interested in those than films that are more self-consciously interested in philosophy. So Sarno has some techniques that are similar to techniques that can be seen in Bergman's films, but not only in Bergman's films. So the
Yes.
claim that this claim that he's a kind of low rent, cheap version of Bergman isn't really wrong, and I wouldn't criticize anyone for using it. And it was meant to help Joe, to make him accessible to intellectuals who would not be interested unless you could compare him to somebody like Bergman, right? But at the same time, I think Joe's work is completely unique, and the way his movies are made were driven by factors that were very personal and very immediate. He wasn't thinking completely abstractly about, let me make a film that looks like a Bergman film, which is
Yeah.
not entirely true either, I
Mm.
would say. But it's a very flattering comparison. And Joe loved Bergman's work, so he would certainly have been happy if people said that to him.
Well, to be honest, I can agree what you're saying, because obviously we live in the well, we always lived basically in the time, and the society and atmosphere where the word of influence, or to be
Yeah,
compared to somebody famous helped a lot and still helps, obviously. So as you say, to be compared to somebody like Bergman certainly helped. But
yeah.
what
It helps make the films accessible to some
exactly?
people
Yeah.
who need that assurance that the film is not just a generic piece of junk.
Or just
So
to
I think it was
be flattered that, oh yeah, I'm watching something like art. But I think that people that
right.
those people are just watching art for just to be seen as, you know, connoisseurs of art, shall we say? Because
There are people like that. There are also people who are sort of obsessed with the problem of influence. You know, who are your influences? This is one of the most generic questions people ask art makers. And it's oftentimes one of the questions that artists really hate answering, both in a sense because it kind of like belittles their own personal struggle, but
yes,
also it gives away their secrets a little bit, you know. But the truth of the matter is almost nothing comes from nowhere.
yeah,
So I would say the greatest artists are working within a tradition. So they're aware in some way of what has happened before them, but they still somehow or other manage to blaze a unique trail, to find their own unique way of doing things. So, you know, the issue of influence only addresses about half the problem of figuring out where an artwork comes from. The other
yeah.
side of it is what's really novel about it, what's unique about it. And that part is a very pleasant mystery to me. Like, I don't really care. You know, I mean, where do my fingerprints come from? Where does the tone of my
Yeah.
voice come from? Where, you know, where these things are, the universe is a complicated place. And so, you know, artworks can come from semi-mysterious origins as well. It's usually intellectuals who try to explain everything in terms of something else.
Yeah.
Everything's an analogy.
Yes.
But I would say maybe the most important thing about art is that it actually does represent radical and fairly mysterious new ways of experiencing things. And so if you watch a Joe Sarno film, there's this general gestalt to the film that you are watching something that's very unique and not really like other movies. And then if you think about it, I'll add one other thing. If you think about it within the context of somebody making movies for a low budget sex film genre, where there are very few expectations of any sort of artistic integrity or aesthetic experimentation. If you think of Joe working in that context, it's like a miracle that he did anything so original, because the people financing those films, the people consuming those films, didn't give a damn about those issues. They just wanted to see some titties.
Yes,
You know,
exactly.
that's about it. So Joe could have been a terrible filmmaker from a formal point of view and still had a decent career, because nobody but Joe really cared about what a good filmmaker was. Although I'll say one other thing quickly. I had the good fortune to interview people who worked with him both behind the camera and in front of the camera, actors and technicians.
Hmm.
And they all were very glad they worked with Joe because they understood that he was doing something with integrity. And it was such a pleasure for them to be making these movies with somebody who really took it seriously and had something original to say. You know, and many of these people had worked with other filmmakers who were much more cynical, who had less talent, who knew they were just cranking out a sex film.
Yeah.
And it was a pleasure to work with Joe, I was told many times, because you could take your work seriously and feel proud about it. Because Joe took it seriously and tried to make something with integrity. So I think that, you know, that's a gift that he gave everybody who watches his films if they think about it, but also to the people who were living in that world in the 1960s and then later in the 70s as well.
I read also the statement, which is kind of true because I've seen a couple of movies, but they say that like in 70s golden era of adult film, they say that those were real movies. Basically, they got script, they got a
Yeah.
story, whatever, story it was. But if you cut out the sex scene, you still have a movie to follow.
You
Also,
have a short movie and usually not a very good one, but yeah,
but
you're right. You're
still a
right.
story. So obviously,
Right.
also I would say with the Joe Sarno, would you say that if you cut out the sex scene, would those movies make sense as from like narrative point of view and the linear scripting if we can go there, they still would have a point to drive home, right?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. Yes, there was enough of a substantial storyline
Hmm.
to support the film, even if you pulled out the sex scenes. That's
Yes.
the yes part. The no part is that Joe's films were almost always about sex. The sex didn't happen incidentally on the side. They were about sex and about sexuality and about people's sexual relationships. So
Yeah.
if you took out the sex parts, it would be people talking about the thing that then you never actually saw happen in the movie. And I'm talking about going back to the sexploitation films where there was no explicit sex, right?
Yes.
These were what people call soft core films now. Some simulated sex. Very early on, there's hardly anything, just some people groping one another and rolling around, and they, when it
Yes.
gets very heavy,
Exactly. Yeah.
they kind of like sink down out of the frame so you can't see what they're doing, right? So to answer your question, yes, he wrote complete substantial scripts. I've seen these scripts. In fact, I own copies of several of them. Some of the people who worked with him gave me their scripts later in their lives. It's a complete script, just like any movie would have. But the sex scenes do wind up being an integral part of what
Hmm.
Joe is trying to talk about. So I think you would feel like something was missing if they were taken out. Now, that's not true with a lot of other sex films where the movie's about whatever, a pizza, a guy, somebody calls up and orders a pizza, and the pizza delivery man comes. And then the next thing you know, the
Yeah.
guy delivering the pizza is having sex with the person who ordered it, right? This is not,
Exactly.
so that's not a movie of, that could be a movie about pizza, but it's really just a very thin premise
Yeah.
for contriving a chain of sex scenes, right?
Poor excuse, I would say, for a
Right.
story. Yeah.
And,
Exactly.
and, and let me explain a little bit why that was so, particularly in America in the early to well, let's say throughout the 1970s. In the United States, obscene images are still technically against the law and are not protected by the American Constitution, which guarantees a right to free speech.
Yes.
But it's never been accepted that it absolutely guarantees a right to show sex acts, particularly in the form of a photograph or cinema, right? So there were lots of questions about whether or not sex films were legal in this country. And we never had any censorship at the national level. In some of the states, like in New York, there was a
Yeah.
censorship office. But on the federal level, as we say, the national government in Washington, there was never any censorship office, as there frequently was in the European countries. So that's a difference. So what filmmakers would have to do is to justify their film if it contains sex, particularly something that was stronger than the norm,
Yep.
they would have to justify the reason for that sex being there. Otherwise, it could be considered to be obscene in these various parts of the country where there was an inclination to prosecute films of a sexual nature. That wasn't always true. But one of the great ironies that most people don't know about was that up until 1965, there was censorship in New York State. So in New York City, you had censorship till 1965. So you could see a Joe Sarno movie across the river in New Jersey where there was no censorship in an uncut form, but in New York it might be cut, which I think is ironic because everybody thinks that New York was the place where all the terrible things happened, right?
Yeah.
the,
Rotten apple, isn't it?
the big rotten apple, right?
Yeah.
But so in the 1970s, when filmmakers, and it's really not the filmmakers, it's more like the producers and the exhibitors, it's the money people who want the
Yeah.
hardcore. It's the money people who want the hardcore, not necessarily the filmmakers. When films began to include so-called hardcore footage, which means documentary level film of people
Yes.
fucking, all
Yeah.
right, let's say that, okay, having sex, and you see it in the movie. It's not simulated, it's not hidden, you see it, right? When that started to happen, there was a big question: is this obscene? And does that mean it can be prosecuted? And since different states in the United States had different laws, it was very tricky then to distribute your film throughout the whole country. The film might get arrested in one city, but not in another.
Well, that's wasn't that the point of Deep Throat being prosecuted?
Yes, the Deep Throat had to be until there was finally a federal prosecution in the mid 1970s. Early on, Deep Throat was busted, as we say. Busted means the police come in and stop.
It was illegal. Yeah.
It was illegal, right? If you get busted, it means you get arrested. That's a good American slang term. So when the film got busted, it got busted all over the country, playing in different places. But usually what happened is it would go to trial, and if there was a jury trial, the jury would hear the evidence, and the lawyers would make this kind of an argument. They would say, this movie is not obscene because it does one of two things. One, it's a work of art. This movie is so interesting, is so well made, is so unique that it constitutes a work of art, and typically works of art are protected by the First Amendment of the US Constitution. Okay? So if you go to a great museum like the Metropolitan Museum here in New York, even in the 1930s, you could see a painting with a nude woman in it.
Yes.
That was okay. But a magazine with a nude woman in it was not okay. And that's because
it was like that. Yes, I know that.
The magazine was not considered art, but the painting was considered art. Now, as you know, I think art has to do with technique and style. So there are arguments about why certain paintings with nudity in them might be art. Even if they have nudity in them, they might still be art, right?
Yeah.
But the argument that the lawyers would make is, no, this movie is a work of art, therefore it can't be censored. The other thing they would argue is that the film was dealing with sexuality in a way that was important to the public discussion on sexual health and on sexual values. Because the US Supreme Court had made a decision that you could not find a work of art to be obscene if it had so-called redeeming social value.
Yes, exactly.
For instance, there were publishers who published books about how to make a baby.
Yes, there was. If I remember correctly, there was a Kroger Bop and all these 40 Thieves.
Right. There were films in the 1940s.
Michael, we need to stop for now because we have a running out of time for this recording. So we'll come back. Okay.